Sunday dinner at my son's house was always an ordeal, like visiting a foreign country where you don't speak the language and don't care for the local customs. I'd sit at their polished glass and chrome table and feel like a relic, some old fossil they dug up just to show how far the world had moved on. Kevin and Emma's house, built with money I got from selling off a piece of my land, the same land where my father taught me the difference between oak and ash, didn't smell like a home. It smelled like an idea. The air had a sharp, nagging scent of lemongrass from an electric diffuser, mixed with that sterile ozone smell from an air purifier. It was clean, soulless, like a fancy dentist's waiting room. My place, 10 miles down the road, smelled different. It smelled of pine shavings from the workshop, of the old books Clara used to read, and a little like rain, because the back porch had been soaking up the wet autumns for 30 years. My house, the one I built with my own hands from brick and oak beams, stood on its ground solidly, its foundations sunk into the earth like the roots of an old tree. Kevin's place looked like a temporary exhibit, ready to be packed up and moved to a more fashionable zip code at a moment's notice. I'd turned 67, 3 years since I buried Clara, and 40 years of our life along with her. Cancer ate her up, slow and merciless, and left behind a silence that rang louder in my ears than any 5-alarm fire. She wasn't just my wife. She was my anchor, my compass, my safe harbor in any storm. I never touched her things after she was gone. They weren't junk. They were sacred. Her shawl still draped over the back of her favorite chair, the stack of books on her nightstand, her thin-rimmed reading glasses. Every object held a trace of her warmth, of her presence. I was the keeper of that quiet museum, and it was the only job that gave my days any meaning. I sat there, staring at my plate. Emma had made something she called deconstructed shepherd's pie. It was a spoonful of meat, a few artistic smears of potato puree, and 3 asparagus spears laid across each other. It looked like a miniature Hindenburg disaster on a plate. As a retired firefighter, a man who'd spent 35 years in heat and smoke, and was used to simple, honest food, I looked at this culinary experiment and thought to myself that I couldn't have baited a hook with that much food. Kevin, my son, was talking a mile a minute. He was a manager of customer experience optimization for some tech company with a name that sounded like a line of alphabet soup. He was a good kid, but he'd been raised soft. I'd taken him fishing, taught him how to hammer a nail straight, but it all seemed to bounce off him like water off a duck's back. He was pliable, eager to please, always trying to avoid a fight, especially with his wife, Emma. Emma was his opposite, sharp, driven. She moved and talked like she was closing a deal every second. Her eyes were always sizing things up, scanning the room. She looked at the world as a collection of resources to be managed efficiently. She looked at me the same way, an obsolete asset, taking up space and requiring maintenance, but no longer providing any real return. So we decided to implement a new CRM system, Kevin was saying. It's going to completely change the paradigm of our user engagement. I nodded, pretending I knew what the hell he was talking about. Paradigm. CRM. In my day, user engagement meant pulling people from a burning building, fixing their burst pipes, or delivering their baby when the ambulance got stuck in a snowstorm. But those days were gone. Everything was in the cloud now. And that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a glint of light. A quick flash as Emma reached across the table for the water pitcher. My brain, trained over decades to pick out the small, important details from the chaos of a fire, snagged on it. I looked up. Emma set the pitcher down and rested her hand elegantly on the table beside her plate, and my heart stopped. I don't mean that as a figure of speech. It literally seized up in my chest, skipping a beat. Then it started up again. A heavy, dull thud, like a drum at a funeral. On her ring finger, on her perfectly manicured, polished finger, sat the ring. The ring. A small, simple band of gold, worn dark with time. The gold I'd bought by selling my first car. In the center was a tiny, smooth sliver of bog oak. I'd carved it myself, in my workshop, from a branch of the old tree Clara and I had our first kiss under. I'd worked on it for 3 nights, straight after my shifts at the firehouse. My rough, calloused hands fumbling to create something delicate. That ring was my vow, my promise. My poetry carved in wood, because I didn't have the words to write it on paper. I remembered slipping it onto Clara's slender finger, and the way she'd cried. Not with loud joy, but with a deep, quiet understanding. I remembered that ring on her hand as she held our son, Kevin, for the first time. I remembered her twisting it on her finger out of worry whenever I left for a dangerous shift. I remembered the dim shine of that ring in the half-light of the hospital room, her hand, almost translucent, lying on top of mine. I took it off her cold finger myself, just before they closed the casket. I whispered a promise to her then, that it would stay with me, a piece of her soul. It belonged in the little cherry wood box I'd made for her, on her nightstand, in her room, a room I now entered like a shrine. And here it was, on Emma's hand, in this sterile house, on this cold table, like a trophy looted from a conquered land. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. Kevin's voice became a meaningless drone. I stared at the ring, and a feeling rose up in me. Not anger. Anger would have been too hot, too alive. This was ice. A cold, paralyzing wave of disbelief at the sheer, unthinkable violation. They hadn't just taken an object. They had taken a sacred thing, dragged it out into the light, dusted it off, and put it on like a vintage trinket from a flea market. I looked down at my plate and forced myself to chew a piece of meat. It tasted like cardboard. I stayed quiet. I was a firefighter. I knew that panic is the worst enemy. First, you assess the situation, locate the source of the blaze, and then you act, with purpose and with a cool head. "You're quiet tonight, Dad," Kevin said after they'd finished their coffee. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, son. Just tired," I said. My voice was surprisingly steady. I glanced at Emma. She gave me her signature, brilliant white smile. The ring on her finger caught the light and seemed to wink at me. Time for me to head out. I didn't make a scene. Scenes are for people with weak arguments. I shook my son's hand, nodded at Emma, and walked out into the cool evening air. My old Ford F-150 was waiting for me at the curb, like a faithful dog. The cab smelled of an honest life, oil, sawdust, and the faint ghosts of cigarette smoke from back when Clara was still fighting with me to quit. I got in, but didn't turn the key. I just sat there in the dark, looking at the glowing windows of their house. Then I pulled out my old flip phone, the one Emma called my calculator, and dialed my son. He picked up on the second ring. "Dad? You haven't left yet? Something wrong?" "The ring," I said. Just the one word. It landed like a stone. "The ring on Emma's finger." There was a pause on the line. I could hear Emma ask a question in the background, and Kevin's muffled reply. I could picture him, a guilty little smile on his face, shrugging. Then he came back on, his voice laced with that telltale tone I'd known since he was a boy. The sound of a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Oh, that... Yeah. Look, Dad. Emma found it in the jewelry box in your bedroom. She was helping me go through some old stuff, to clear out some space. She just fell in love with it, Dad. Said it was such a beautiful story. I figured..." You know, let her wear it. It's not like Mom would have minded. Mom wouldn't have minded. Those words, meant to soothe me, hit me like a sledgehammer. He spoke of Clara like she was some benevolent ghost, happy to have her things passed around. He didn't remember her quiet pride, her gentle but unbreakable will. He didn't know her. It's more than a ring, Kevin, I said, my voice low, and then Emma chimed in. He must have put me on speakerphone to share the burden. Her voice was breezy and condescending. Ray, hi, I'm so glad you noticed. It's gorgeous, isn't it? I just believe things like this should be lived in, not gathering dust in a box. They should be passed down. It's my family heirloom now, a symbol of continuity. I mean, it's not like you're using it anymore, right? My family heirloom now. Right? I didn't answer. I just quietly flipped the phone shut. Sitting there in the dark of my truck, I looked at my own house off in the distance, and for the first time in 3 years of being alone, I felt truly lonely. Not because Clara was gone, but because I, still living and breathing, had already been written off. I was just the caretaker of a museum, and they had started to help themselves to the exhibits. If I'd known I'd end up a ghost in my own family photos, I muttered into the silence, I'd have bought myself a boat and sailed to God knows where instead of breaking my back to make their down payment on this fishbowl of a house. And the chill that had settled in me at the dinner table was starting to turn to steel. The drive home felt endless, though I'd made it thousands of times. Every turn, every tree on the side of the road was painfully familiar. But tonight it all looked alien, like I was seeing the world through a sheet of distorted glass. I parked the truck by the garage and went inside. A floorboard in the entryway creaked. The same one I'd promised Clara I'd fix back when Reagan was in office. The sound used to be an annoyance, then a habit. Tonight, it sounded like a groan. The groan of a house that felt as plundered and hollowed out as I did. I walked through the dark living room without turning on a light. The shadows of the furniture seemed thick and hostile. In the kitchen, I drew a glass of water straight from the tap and drank it down in one go. The water was hard, with the taste of iron. The taste of my childhood, the taste of this land. It was the only real thing I'd felt all evening. Then I went upstairs, into our bedroom. The air was still and preserved, like in a sealed tomb. Everything was where it belonged. Her robe on the chair, the stack of books, her glasses. I walked over to the nightstand. There, beside the lamp, was the jewelry box. My work. Cherry wood, polished to a deep shine with beeswax, with an inlay of a tiny songbird. I'd spent a month on it, making sure the lid closed with a soft, satisfying click, without the slightest gap. My fingers, rough and gnarled from decades of working with fire, metal, and wood, trembled as I touched the lid. I lifted it. It was empty, just the deep red velvet lining, with a faint circular impression still visible. An imprint, the ghost of the ring. I stared at the emptiness and my breath caught in my chest. That wasn't a metaphor. The air just stopped coming into my lungs. It felt as if a surgeon had reached into my chest and carved out something vital, leaving a bleeding hole behind. I slowly closed the box. The click I'd once so carefully engineered sounded deafeningly loud, like a gunshot in the quiet room. I couldn't stay in there. I went downstairs and out the back door. The night was cool and clear. A dog barked in the distance. I walked across the dew-wet grass to my sanctuary, the workshop. It was a small shed I'd built myself when I was a young man. There was no room for lemongrass or ocean breeze in here. This place smelled as a man's world should. of sharp, resinous sawdust, machine oil, turpentine, and the biting scent of wood varnish. It was the smell of creation, of honest labor. My tools hung on the walls in perfect order: planes, chisels, saws, hammers, each on its own hook. I could find any one of them with my eyes closed. In the center stood a massive oak workbench, its surface a road map of my life, covered in a network of scratches, dents, and burn marks. I sat on an old stool that groaned under my weight and switched on the flexible neck lamp. Its warm, yellow light cut a circle out of the gloom. I closed my eyes and let the memories flood in. I'm 27. I'm standing right here, in this same workshop, only it still smells of fresh pine resin. I've just come home from a brutal shift, an old warehouse fire on the edge of town, and I can still feel the smell of smoke in my hair. My hands are humming with exhaustion, but I don't go inside the house. I clamp a tiny, almost black piece of bog oak into a small vise, a branch from the tree where I first dared to tell Clara I couldn't live without her. I have to make her a ring because I have to ask her for forgiveness. Not for cheating or for a lie. I would have died first. I have to ask forgiveness for my silence. I love her so much the feeling is bursting out of my chest. But the words, the beautiful and right words, get stuck in my throat. I'm a simple guy from a working-class neighborhood. I don't know how to talk about love. I know how to prove it. By fixing a leaky roof. By carrying her across puddles. By getting up at 3 in the morning to stoke the furnace. And so, I pour all my unspoken words into this ring. Every cut of the chisel, every stroke of sandpaper is an unsaid I love you. The gold, bought with my last savings, becomes the setting for the main thing, for a piece of our shared place, our shared history. When I slipped it onto her finger, right here in this workshop, she looked at me with her clear eyes and cried, and I knew she had heard everything, every single word I had carved into that piece of wood. The years flew by. The ring became a part of her. It was on her hand when she wiped away tears at Kevin's high school graduation. It was dusted with flour when she baked her famous apple pie. Dirt from the garden would get caked under its rim when she planted her roses. It was pressing into my hand at the hospital when, after a wall collapsed on me at a fire, the doctors told me it was a miracle I was alive. "It's all right," she had whispered, the cold metal of the ring against my cheek. "You'll be home more now. You'll build all your nephews the best wooden horses." And I did. The fear of losing her was my constant silent companion. Not a fear of death itself, but the fear of being left in a world bleached of its color without her. When the diagnosis came, that fear took on flesh and blood, becoming a monster that lived in the room with me. I sat by her bed, holding her fading hand. She grew thinner, wasting away before my eyes, but the ring on her finger remained unchanged, a stubborn symbol of a time when we were young and strong and believed in forever. On one of her last nights, she struggled to lift her hand. "Look, Ray," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "It's still here. Our story." And now that story, my story, Clara's story, had been slipped onto a stranger's finger and called a family heirloom. I stood up and walked to the tall metal cabinet in the corner of the workshop. I pulled out a heavy cardboard box on which Clara had written in her elegant script, "Our treasures." I opened it. Inside, tied neatly with ribbons, were bundles of letters we had written to each other in the early years when I took jobs out of town. Old yellowed photographs and thick albums with parchment paper between the pages. Her high school diaries. I started flipping through the albums. There we were, so young, on the shore of that lake. There was Kevin, a year old, sitting on my shoulders. The three of us by our old pickup truck, ready to go on vacation to the mountains. I turned page after page, and then I realized many of the photos were missing. Empty corners where they had been pried out. I remembered Kevin's words. Emma was helping me go through some old stuff. She had gone through them. She had digitized whatever she found photogenic, and most likely thrown the originals away. Why keep all this dusty old paper in the digital age? That's probably what she'd said to my son, and he had agreed. I wasn't just being erased. My life was being systematically archived and discarded as obsolete. My past, my love, my pain, it was all being turned into a set of files in the cloud. I sat in my workshop until dawn. The cold gray light filtered through the dusty window, illuminating the mess on the workbench. There was no hatred in me. There was only a cold, ringing clarity. I had swallowed a lot. Emma's digs about my old house, my son's inattention, their constant busyness whenever I needed a hand. I had stayed silent for the sake of the family. But there is a line, and they had crossed it. It was not their ring. It was not their story. It was not their right. I took a sheet of paper from the workbench drawer and an old ballpoint pen. It was time to break the silence, not with a shout, but with clear, measured words, like a blueprint for a wall you're about to build. A wall between my world and theirs. A week passed, a week of heavy, viscous silence, the kind that comes before a thunderstorm. I didn't call. Calls are for emotions, for excuses, for arguments. I chose a different path. I wrote a letter, not on a computer, by hand on a thick sheet of paper. My handwriting, accustomed over decades to drawing numbers and lines on blueprints, was angular but clear. I weighed every word like a pharmacist weighs a prescription. Kevin, Emma, all my life I believed that a family is like a house you build together, brick by brick, with your own hands. You create your own traditions, your own stories, your own symbols. The ring that is on your finger now, Emma, is not just a piece of jewelry. It is the chief symbol of my 40-year union with your mother. In it are our shared sunrises and sunsets, our joys and our pain. I carved it from our shared past. If your love and your family begin with appropriating someone else's symbols, then you are building your house on a foreign foundation. A house like that won't be strong. You are not creating something of your own. You are simply taking a place in a story that has already been written. I am not asking. I am demanding that you return what belongs only to me and to the memory of Clara. Dad. I folded the letter into a plain envelope and drove it over myself. I didn't put it in the mailbox. I tucked it between the door and the door jamb, so they couldn't say they didn't see it. It was my silent ultimatum. There was no reply, not a call, not a text. I waited. Patience was part of my trade. A firefighter can't rush. He has to wait for the roof to burn through before he can go in. A carpenter waits for the glue to dry. I knew how to wait. I went about my business. I rebuilt the motor in the old lawnmower. I pruned back the overgrown rose bushes that Clara had planted. But the silence was pressing on my ears. I knew that in their glass house, a council of war was being held. They were deciding how to optimize this problem. The second blow came the following Saturday. It was a warm autumn day. I was sitting on the back porch in my old creaky rocking chair, drinking cold coffee and watching the leaves fall from the big maple tree. My phone, lying on the railing, vibrated. I flinched. It was a text from Kevin. I expected anything. A clumsy apology, excuses, even anger. But what I read was worse than a knife in the back. Dad, Emma and I had a very serious talk after your letter. We understand you're upset, but frankly, you're being extremely selfish. You're dwelling on the past. This ring is part of our family's legacy, and Emma and I are the continuation of that family. Emma is my wife, and she has every right to wear it. She wears it with pride and love for Mom. Your attempts to create drama out of nothing are very hurtful to her. She's already working herself to the bone. We thought you would be happy that Mom's memory is living on, not gathering dust in a dark box. Please stop pressuring us and manipulating us with your grief. We will not be returning to this conversation again. I reread the message over and over. The words, selfish, drama, manipulating with grief, jumped out at me. They didn't just misunderstand. They had taken my feelings, my pain, turned them inside out, and thrown them back in my face, accusing me of every sin in the book. It was I, it turned out, who was the selfish one, clinging to the past. I was the manipulator, and they were the noble guardians of memory, whom I was preventing from living their lives. And in that moment, something inside me snapped, loudly, with a dry crack, as if a thick steel cable holding the entire structure of my patience had broken. My whole life, built on compromises for them, to avoid fights, to keep the peace, crumbled into dust. I had never demanded gratitude for the sleepless nights by a sick Kevin's bedside, for the truck I sold to pay for his college, for the thousands of little things that make up a father's duty, but I had expected at least a crumb of respect. And what I got was the brand of a selfish manipulator. The phone vibrated again, a notification from that social media network that Emma had forced me to join. So you can stay in the loop, Ray. I almost never opened the app, considering it a vanity fair. But something made me press the icon, and I saw it. Emma had posted a new photo, taken professionally, with the right lighting. Her hand, with a perfect manicure, was holding a cup of latte in close-up. And on her ring finger, in the very center of the frame, it shone. My Clara's ring. The caption read, "When a family's history becomes your history. Incredibly happy to wear this symbol of love and continuity. Thank you to my amazing husband for sharing this legacy with me." Family, legacy, love, tradition, blessed. I scrolled through the comments, dozens of ecstatic squeals from her friends. How beautiful. Emma, it looks so good on you. A real family heirloom. And one from some cousin of hers. Stunning. It's so important when the older generation has the wisdom to let go of the past and pass it on to the young, unlike some who cling to every old piece of junk until they die. And a winking emoji. I stared at the phone screen, and the room swam before my eyes. It was a public execution. They hadn't just stolen the ring. They had turned it into a prop for their glossy play. They had put my pain, my memory, on public display, like a strange beast in a cage. They had humiliated me, presenting me to their entire circle of acquaintances as a senile old miser who clings to every old piece of junk. The phone on the table started ringing again. Kevin, then again, and the screen glowed. 35 missed calls. They knew they had crossed the line, and now they were trying to conduct an emergency optimization session. But it was too late. The fire had already engulfed the entire building. I didn't answer. I sat in the gathering dusk and watched the last rays of sunlight fade on the treetops. And I made a decision. They wanted to play in the modern world? By its rules? Fine. In this world, there aren't just likes and hashtags. There are also paragraphs, articles, and laws, and they work a lot more reliably than their phony family values. The next morning was cold and clear. The ice inside me had solidified overnight into a monolithic block of resolve. The grief and pain hadn't gone away. They had just become fuel. I was no longer a victim, mourning my past. I was a veteran heading into his last battle. I didn't drive to the shiny downtown office where young lawyers in $1,000 suits drink smoothies and speak in tongues. I drove to the old industrial outskirts of Oak Creek, to a 2-story brick building with an auto body shop on the ground floor and a modest office on the second, with a sign that read, Frank Miller, Attorney at Law. Frank and I weren't friends in the usual sense. We were two old soldiers who had been through Vietnam, only he had been in the jungle, and I had been in the fires. What united us was the understanding that there are more important things in life than money and comfort. Honor, for example. I walked up the worn concrete stairs and into his office, which smelled of old paper, cheap coffee, and some kind of ointment for his sciatica. Frank, a heavy-set man with a face like sun-cracked earth, sat behind a desk buried in folders. "Ray," he grumbled without looking up, "if you're here again about your neighbor's rooster waking you up at 5, I'm telling you right now, it's a lost cause. Roosters have rights." "It's more serious, Frank," I said, and sat down in the creaky visitor's chair. And I laid it all out, without emotion, like giving a report. The dry facts. The dinner, the ring, the conversation, the letter, the text message, the post on the internet. I spoke in a monotone, and this calmness made the story sound even more outrageous. At the end, I took a folder from my old briefcase and laid a few documents on the table. Frank listened, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands over his stomach. His small eyes studied my face intently. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. "Well, damn," he finally said. "The new generation. They live on the internet. They don't have anything tangible, anything real, so they grasp at other people's artifacts to give their own lives some weight. Like savages who find a watch on the beach and hang it around their necks as an amulet, not knowing it tells time." He took the documents I had brought. It was Clara's will, in which all property went to me, and an insurance policy from 40 years ago. I had paid the premiums on it my whole life. It was a habit drilled into me by my father. Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Clara had insisted we insure her few pieces of jewelry after a neighbor's house was robbed. Frank put on his glasses and began to read. So, wedding ring, 14-karat gold, bog oak inlay, handmade. Appraised value at the time of insurance. He whistled. $5,000. Clara was a smart woman, Ray. She knew it wasn't about the wood, it was about the story. The appraiser understood that too. He took off his glasses. This, my friend, changes everything. This is no longer family whining, in the style of, "you don't respect me." This is a section of the state penal code. Unlawful appropriation of another's property that is part of an estate. And its value is not symbolic. Your son and his slick little wife are in deep shit. "What are we going to do?" I asked. "There are 2 ways," Frank said. "The loud way and the quiet way. The loud way is a lawsuit. Summonses, hearings, arguments. It's messy, nerve-wracking, and time-consuming. The quiet way is an official lawyer's notice. A dry, soulless piece of paper that lists the articles of the law and the possible consequences, including a criminal record. With people like them, that usually works better than yelling. They're not afraid of scandals. They're afraid of a stain on their perfect digital reputation and problems with the bank that gave them their mortgage." "Quietly," I said, "but so it gets through." A wise decision, Frank nodded. True strength isn't in decibels. It's in the weight of paper and steel. 2 days later, the letter was ready. It wasn't just a text. It was a weapon. Cold, precise, and ruthless. We are notifying you that the wedding ring of the late Clara Walker, which is personal property of our client, Mr. Ray Walker, as confirmed by the will and insurance policy number, is currently being unlawfully withheld by you. These actions may be classified under Section 2913.02 of the State Penal Code as theft. We strongly demand the return of the said property within 72 hours of receiving this notice to the address. Otherwise, we will be forced to take the matter to court with a claim not only for the return of the property, but also for compensation for moral damages, and to file a statement with the county prosecutor's office. This time, I didn't have to wait long. That same evening, my phone blew up. Kevin was the first to call. He wasn't yelling. He was screeching. "Dad, are you out of your mind? You hired a lawyer. You're threatening to send your own son and his wife to jail over some old trinket." Emma is hysterical. Her blood pressure is through the roof. "You'll disgrace us all over town. How could you?" I let him scream himself out. When he fell silent to catch his breath, I calmly replied, "I'm not threatening. I'm informing you of the consequences of your actions. You left me no other choice." "But this is family." "You don't do this in a family," he yelled. "The family ended when you put my soul up for auction on the internet." I cut him off. "Emma wanted to live in the modern world. By modern rules? Fine. Here they are. Paper and steel. The law. You have 72 hours. Actually, less than that now." And I hung up. Then Emma called. She was sobbing and accusing me of ruining her life. Then her mother called, screaming that I was a heartless monster. I didn't answer anymore. I just turned off the sound. On the third day, Emma's shiny black car pulled up to my house. She flew out of it like a fury. A perfect hairdo, an expensive suit, but her face was twisted with anger. She didn't come to the door. She ran up to the porch and threw a small velvet pouch onto the wooden steps with force. "Choke on your relic," she hissed. "I hope you're happy, you old tyrant. You've destroyed everything." She turned on her heel, jumped into the car, and sped off, leaving a spray of gravel from her spinning tires. I waited until the sound of her engine faded and the dust settled. Then I slowly walked down the steps and picked up the pouch. I untied the drawstrings. Inside, on the black velvet, lay the ring. My Clara's ring. I held it in my hand. It was warm. From a stranger's fingers. There was no happiness. No victory either. There was only a hard-won, cold sense of restored justice. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had only defended my boundaries. I stood alone in the middle of my yard, clutching the symbol of my entire life, and I knew that the war was over. But the world would never be the same. I didn't put the ring back in the box. That would have been wrong. You can't return an icon to a desecrated temple and pretend nothing happened. For a few days, it just lay on my workbench in the workshop, among the wood shavings, blueprints, and old tools. It seemed like a foreign object in this world of honest labor, defiled by the touch of a fake, glossy world. I looked at it while I drank my morning coffee and knew that its story in this house was over. There was no anger. Even less was there a desire for revenge or gloating. There was only a deep, soul-sucking sorrow, a sorrow that my son, my own blood, had grown into a man who couldn't see the difference between a legacy and a resource. I had won the battle for an object, but I had lost something much greater. By the end of the week, I knew what I had to do. I went up to the bedroom and took a heavy, plain matte steel urn from the back of the wardrobe. It held Clara's ashes. I had kept it for 3 years, unable to decide what to do. She had never said where she wanted to be buried. "Just be near me, Ray," was all she had ever said, and I had been, keeping the urn as the last thing I had left of her. But now I understood. Keeping her here, in this house that had become a battlefield, was unfair to her. Her spirit deserved peace. I took the urn. I took the ring. I got in my old Ford and drove north, away from the town to where the neat farm fields end and the wild, overgrown forest begins, to where a small, crystal-clear lake lay nestled among the hills, like a piece of the sky. Our lake, the place where I, a clumsy 20-year-old kid in a firefighter's uniform that was too big for him, had first worked up the courage to tell an 18-year-old Clara that I thought I was in it for the long haul. I arrived at sunset. The sky was ablaze with every shade of orange and purple. The air was cool and fresh, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. There wasn't a soul on the shore. Just me, the deafening silence, and my memories. I opened the heavy lid of the urn. I took the ring in my palm. For a moment, the thought of slipping it onto my own pinky finger crossed my mind, but I immediately dismissed it. It was her ring, part of her hand, part of her. I held it one last time, trying to remember the warmth of her skin, not the cold fury of Emma's, and then I dropped it into the urn, mixing the tarnished gold and timeless wood with her ashes. It was the right thing to do. The symbol had to be reunited with its meaning. The story had to come to its conclusion. I waded into the water up to my knees. The icy water burned my legs, but I barely felt it. I lifted the urn and scattered its contents over the surface of the lake. A light evening breeze caught the gray dust, and it swirled in the rays of the setting sun, settling on the dark, still water, like a sprinkling of stars. "Sorry it took me so long, my love," I whispered into the silence. And for the first time in 3 long, painful years, I felt not the sharp pain of loss, but a light, peaceful sadness and relief. I had protected her. I had let her go. 6 months passed. Time moved slowly, like resin down a pine trunk. I lived. I fixed that creaky floorboard. I started building a new boat in the workshop, not for a customer, but for myself, out of cedar. I wanted to launch it on our lake. I was quiet a lot, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the silence of resentment, but the silence of a man who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. Kevin didn't call, neither did I. The line between us had been drawn too deep. I didn't expect an apology. I didn't expect anything. I was rebuilding my life on a foundation that no one could take from me again. One damp November evening, as I sat on the porch wrapped in an old jacket, a car pulled up to the house. Not Emma's shiny SUV, but the old, beaten-up sedan that Kevin used to drive before her. He got out of the car, alone. He wasn't wearing his usual office slacks, but faded jeans and a simple flannel shirt. He had lost weight and looked tired, as if some rod had been pulled out of his spine and he had slumped. He walked up to the porch and stopped at the bottom step. He didn't dare to come up. We sat in silence for a long time. He stared at his scuffed boots, I at him. "You were right, Dad," he finally said. His voice was quiet, hollow. I was silent. I let him talk. It was his path to walk, his words to say. "Emma and I split up a month ago." He looked up at me. There was no anger or resentment in his eyes, only a bottomless emptiness. It wasn't just about the ring. The ring was the detonator. It just showed that there was nothing there. "You were right. We never built anything of our own. We were living on a set. We took your money for the house, your story with the ring. We tried to appropriate your life because we didn't have one of our own. And when you took back what was yours, it turned out we were standing in an empty room with nothing to say to each other. He fell silent, swallowing the lump in his throat. I felt no gloating, no satisfaction, only an echo of that long-ago fatherly pain for my foolish lost son. Now build something of your own, I said. My voice was steady, without judgment. I'm not giving you anything else. No money, no advice, no ready-made stories. But you can take responsibility. That's the one thing a man shouldn't ask for. He should just take it. He nodded slowly, like a man who had been struggling to swallow a bitter pill but had finally done it. Can I? He hesitated. Can I come by sometimes? Not to talk, just to help around the house, to fix something. I looked around at my old house, my world, at the crooked fence by the garden that I kept putting off. The fence needs painting, I said, looking off into the distance at the darkening treetops. And a couple of boards need replacing. They're starting to rot. It wasn't forgiveness. It was much more than that. It was a chance to start building from the ground up with his own two hands.